creating a resilient Jacksonville. In 2021, under the Curry administration, the City of Jacksonville hired its first Chief Resilience Officer. Since then, she's been gathering and analyzing data and talking to experts in search of local solutions to issues that are being exacerbated by climate change. This includes flooding from sea level rise and extreme heat. Almost 2 years in the making, the report is one of the most detailed analyses any city has created. I'm here today with the city's Chief Resilience Officer, Anne Coglianese. A little bit later, we're going to be joined by our own Jessica Palombo to talk about a panel discussion hosted by Jacksonville Today's Adapt on what the report means for Jacksonville. But first, Anne, welcome. Nice to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is a dense 294-page report, but I'm going to start by doing the unforgivable and asking you to summarize it.
I mean, I don't know if I can summarize 294 pages, but what I will say is that this is a really visionary document. It spans 50 years of planning for Jacksonville, looks at all hazards and shocks that could affect our city, whether that's environmental or economic and social hazards as well. And really centers around 45 actions and 90 sub-actions that the city must take in order to make sure that our residents are prepared for the future. This document was developed, as you said, based on science and data, but also through robust public engagement. And it was really important to me that the final document really feel representative of the many neighborhoods and ecosystems and communities that we have in Jacksonville. So there's an entire section of the document on how these actions really get deployed in different landscapes across our city. And this place-based section is really one of the things that I think sets the strategy apart. And I hope what will make it digestible for residents and they can really see themselves in this document and where they live, and the good and the bad, what climate change and these future hazards could mean for their communities, but also have a lot more confidence in what types of solution the city is going to deploy to protect them.
And there really are very different hazards, risks for different parts of the community. They are all very unique in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think so often conversations about climate and resilience focus on the last storm. So we know Matthew and Irma had major impacts in downtown. And so that's been where a lot of the conversation has been taking place. But we know that where the last storm hit is not indicative of where the next one will. And so it was important that we looked at comprehensive data sets for flooding, but also looked at dangers from heat. We know that flooding might be the most expensive hazard we face, but that extreme heat is often the deadliest. And so we have a lot of areas of the city with a lot of concrete, very built out and low tree canopy, and those communities are just as at risk. And we wanted to make sure that this strategy put those hazards on an equal playing field because we wanted to make sure we were taking steps to take care of all of our residents.
And I've wondered if, as devastating as those storms, Matthew and Irma, were for certain parts of our community, if they weren't in some ways useful demonstratives to kind of indicate what sorts of hazards we might face. I wonder, too, if this summer's heat perhaps drives home just exactly what it means to be in a really intense heat environment. How would you talk about people's experiences with those climate exacerbated events helping to bring your message home?
Absolutely. I think when I first got here, was hearing a lot of stories about people's experience through Matthew and Irma. And in many ways, it seemed like a wake-up call for local residents. I also think we took a lot of care in developing this document to look at examples of issues that have happened in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. Instead of having to wait for a hazard to affect Jacksonville before we're catalyzed to action, let's look at the extreme freeze event that hit the Houston area and caused mass infrastructure disruptions in Texas. Let's look at the heat waves that hit London a couple summers ago and caused bridges and tarmacs to start melting. These are things that are massive wake-up calls, and we want to get ahead of it. We want to make sure Jacksonville's in a position where we've planted a lot of trees. We've cooled our built environment so we have less of that melting effect from heat. We also want to make sure that we have emergency plans for things like freeze events. So I think by looking at case studies in other places and infusing that into the actions that we include in this strategy, our intention is to put Jacksonville in a better position than places that were caught off guard by these hazards.
The one thing that really struck me when I was looking through the report is how much city land remains undeveloped. I think of, this massive growth that we've been seeing, but The report says that out of the city's 834 square miles, 499 square miles are still undeveloped.
Yeah, roughly 40% of the city is currently developed. I mean, of the remaining 60%, we have a lot of areas that are upland wetlands and kind of vulnerable ecosystems. And so I think not all of that 60% is really in the development potential. But I think one of the most interesting conclusions that I found from our research and from putting together this strategy is just how much growth is going to be a factor in Jacksonville's long-term resilience. If we were to just look at what's at risk today and taking steps to protect our current vulnerabilities, and we allowed growth to continue in the same manner and pace and style as the past, we'll find that we actually have a compounded issue in the future. And we were able to quantify that. And we looked at the next 50 years, Jacksonville is likely to see 685,000 new residents moving here. And if all those new residents are moving into sprawled suburban development, much like we've seen over the last 20 years, we'll find that we'll have 3 times as many people living in areas vulnerable to flooding, 2.5 times as many assets like homes and hospitals vulnerable to flooding, and 1.5 times as many residents vulnerable to extreme heat. So I think that was a really big wake-up call that we have to be very future-oriented. We have to keep growth top of mind. I also think, growth fundamentally is a good thing for a city. This allows us, by doing this data analysis, to guide that growth in a smart way so that we get all of the other benefits that come from that. New people, new industries, new talents, new cultures, those are all positives, but we have to make sure that we're not accidentally straining our housing resources, our utility resources, and that we're not building out into landscapes that are unprepared.
And it's noticeable that a lot of the most at risk when it comes to flooding, for instance, developments are actually very new. They're not old necessarily developments that perhaps didn't plan for an environment where there were, more intense weather. But these really are very recent developments within the last even 5 years that are in some of the most vulnerable places.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that you don't have to live at the beach. You don't have to live on the main channel of the St. Johns River to be vulnerable to flooding. I think the event that happened in Fort Lauderdale just a couple of months ago, where they got extreme rainfall in just a matter of 12 hours, it overwhelmed their city and caused damaging flooding. That can happen in Jacksonville. We're starting to see these more intense and frequent rainstorms in the summer. But I think that's where you start to see our risk really dispersed across the county. It's not just centralized on our water bodies. It's any area that's slightly low-lying and where rainfall can collect, especially with these major rainfall events. So that is something we've planned for in this strategy. It's an avenue that we're expanding into for new data collection so that we have a better way of quantifying where our residents are at risk for rainfall events. Because to your point, you could build a new development and not really be able to quantify the level of risk for that area from a rainfall event. And we want to make sure that we have the tools to do so.
We had teased ahead to this show yesterday. We got an email yesterday from one of our listeners who wanted specifically to ask about the fact that this plan, while it covers Jacksonville and Duval County, doesn't include some really fast-growing bedroom communities, surrounding suburbs, and how that might impact. I mean, if we're doing even our very best here to do what the plan recommends, what about the larger First Coast area?
I think that's a great point. And I will say the way we've developed this, my hope is that there's a lot of transferability to other communities in Northeast Florida. To give you an example, the first action in the strategy is really focused on growth, and one of the recommendations is to update the City of Jacksonville's land development regulations. That's a process that's ongoing. We have a committee that's kicking off next week to really work with the city closely over the next year to make that update. But the types of landscapes and the types of development we would see in Jacksonville, we also see in the county surrounding Duval. And so if we are able to really come to the table and use this data to revise our regulations in a smart way, that should be something that other communities can look at and can select the parts of our regulations that fit their landscapes and their needs without having to start from square one.
The truth, though, I mean, in Florida, traditionally, growth and development, certainly the development community and developers writ large, have wielded enormous power over, elections, over ordinances, over zoning decisions, certainly. How do you propose addressing or somewhat, restraining the incredible power of the development community when it comes to regulations that they're probably going to fight?
I will say the development regulations update that we're undertaking has members of the development community at the planning table with us. So this is something that we will work with them on. I don't want this to come as a surprise to a very, as you said, very influential group of folks. But I also think one of the findings of this strategy was that it's not about limiting development, it's about guiding it in a smart way. And there's a lot of parts of Duval County that are high and dry and are already connected to existing infrastructure. And so I think a big part of the conversation will be how do we shift to more infill development in strategic areas of low risk? And this can have a lot of benefits. We're seeing already across the country that people are trying to move to more urban, walkable spaces. And so looking at, let's say, downtown, the majority of downtown, once you get above Bay Street, is fairly low risk for flooding, and it's already well situated to accommodate a higher density. So how do we make that attractive? So I think we'll be looking at ways that we can incentivize and kind of guide developers to naturally want to build infill in these areas, make it attractive and make it profitable, because we know then we'll also have the co-benefit of having less residents at risk and less recovery to do after events.
We would love for you to join the conversation. You can give us a call at 549-2937. You can tag us on X at FCC On Air. You can send an email to First Coast Connect at wjct.org. And you can also message us on the First Coast Connect Facebook and Instagram pages. I'm here with Anne Coglianese, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Jacksonville. Anne, I want to get back to the report in just a minute, but first I want to ask you at least briefly about a report by the city's Office of Inspector General. Evidently, that office received a complaint from someone in City Hall about your role in the award of 3 city contracts to Louisiana organizations that you'd worked with previously in New Orleans. The investigation concluded that your involvement did not violate any ethics or procurement laws, but recommended that the city tighten its standards for training all city employees to avoid even the appearance of favorable treatment. I don't believe you've had an opportunity yet to talk about this publicly. What would you like to say about that?
I want to make it very clear, all of these contracts were procured by the book with incredible standards. I scored some of these contracts, but with a panel of other city employees. At no point did my knowledge of the firms that bid on these in any way affect the outcome. And I will say, ethics and integrity are really central to how I conduct myself and my work. And so it's disheartening when people, want to look at your character and question it. But the findings really were nothing nefarious went on. And it's not surprising that in a very small field like resilience, where, Louisiana has been hit with more than its fair share of disasters, that there's been a workforce built up there that's really top tier. So I will just say all of the consultants that we've worked with have been unbelievably qualified for these scopes of work. I'm incredibly proud of the team that worked with me to develop the Resilient Jacksonville strategy, and I have the utmost confidence in the integrity of the 2 teams that are still working with the city on upcoming scopes. And at this point, I just hope it doesn't distract from really the bottom line, which is that this work is important, it's urgent, and Jacksonville is really setting itself up to lead the country in many ways on really using science and data to guide planning. And I think for a city the size of Jacksonville to play that leadership role can have a lot of positive impacts on Florida and other parts of the country that are going to need to be facing these issues head on as well.
And we've talked in the past, you and I, about the fact that Jacksonville is seen as very kind of late to the game when it comes to planning for resilience, and that this is an effort that a lot of people say should have started, decades ago, really. So address that a little bit, where we are now versus kind of how we got here.
Yeah, I think I want to correct that impression, especially in light of the Resilient Jacksonville strategy now being out and published. I think in many ways we have vaulted to the front of the pack or near the front and are now players with cities that have been in this field for a long time. especially Florida cities that in South Florida that started this about a decade ago. But I think in many ways we were able to look at what's been done in the past and take the elements of other cities' planning work that would fit in Jacksonville. But due to the size of Jacksonville, we've also really had to innovate. We've had to say, how can we touch every corner of a county this size? And although it's a city strategy, because we're a consolidated city county, this in many ways is a regional planning document in ways that we haven't seen from other cities in the country. So I would just say, folks in Jacksonville should be very proud of this document. One of the things that I've heard time and time again since getting to Jacksonville is, oh, plans they always sit on the shelf. Nobody does anything. And I want to encourage residents to really look through this, find elements of the strategy that they're passionate about, and keep pressure on the city to implement this. It's been exciting, even since we've launched it, to see all of the components starting to come together. In fact, when we were finalizing copy edits of this document, as you mentioned, we had this heat wave over the summer, and one of our recommendations was that we knew was going to be in the strategy was how do we expand the access and availability and hours of cooling centers. And of course, the mayor's office did that. So some of these actions have already gotten underway before we even launched the document. Others are ongoing right now. As I mentioned, the land development regulation update. We also secured a FEMA grant already to do an extreme heat and freeze emergency plan. I've had 2 fellows who started this week. One is leading an urban forestry master planning process, and the other is developing a climate action plan for the region. So it's really exciting to see this all come together, to already feel the drumbeat of implementation starting off. And I really hope residents are able to look at this document, able to see elements of it that they're impressed with, and really, really make sure the city continues to press forward in implementing this.
And so on that front, we have a message from Joss on Facebook saying, I had a chance to read the publication over the weekend and was pleased to see the frequent mention of tree canopies and creative uses for abandoned concrete areas. So great job on that. Just please, no more palm trees, which provide almost no shade, absorb almost no carbon or heat, and provide no shelter for animals. That's the comment.
I feel like I've gotten a question about palm trees every time I've been on this program, and I think what the individual who wrote in is really referencing is the fact that you get less co-benefits with a palm tree than you do with other forms of shade trees, and so that is absolutely something that we will be looking at, and I think the piece that goes beyond just palm tree or another species of tree is actually really looking at climate adaptive plants and species and making sure that we're planting trees that can deal with hotter summers and can also deal with more inconsistent fluctuations in rainfall. We need to make sure that we're planting really hardy species so that all of this, effort and attention on tree canopy actually has the longevity we need.
Is that, are there any specific ones that come to mind for you, or is that something that still has yet to be determined?
Oh, I so set myself up for that. I do not know tree species off the top of my head. But again, like I mentioned, we have a fellow that just started and is leading this urban forestry master planning process, and that will be something that's looked at. And so I think a number of ecologists and landscape experts will be weighing in. So you'll have people with more knowledge of trees than I contributing to that process.
We also got a tweet on X from Brian. He says, what are the plans for water quality improvement?
We talk about that in a number of parts in the document. A lot of the green infrastructure solutions and nature-based solutions to flooding and stormwater also have co-benefits for water quality. And as part of creating the vision for Jacksonville's resilient future, we really wanted to underscore that the health of our ecosystems is really tied to the health and the quality of life of our residents. This is something that the mayor has also echoed with the creation of the city's first chief health officer. So we're working closely together to make sure that ecosystem health is really addressed because we know it has an underlying impact on public health. So something like water quality is really top of mind because the more nutrients and runoff that gets into our river is something that can contribute to toxic algae blooms, which we know has an impact on individuals' respiratory systems, especially our vulnerable populations that are already struggling with asthma. So we absolutely see water quality as not just something that benefits our environment and the species that live in our river system, but also as part of how we create a healthy and vibrant city for residents.
And that brings me to, this is not just a report about climate change impacts and sea level rise. It really delves into socioeconomic issues and vulnerabilities. Why did you choose to cast such a wide net in this study?
I think it was important to me that we really approached this topic with an equity lens. And when you see an event, a shock like a hurricane hit a city, it's usually made worse by an underlying stress like poverty or lack of access to transportation. And so it was important that when we evaluated exposure to threats, environmental threats like flooding or heat, that we also understood the social and economic factors that could make those hazards worse for our residents. We made sure at multiple steps in our planning process that we were pulling census data into our analysis, not just looking at FEMA data sets or Army Corps data sets or NOAA from an environmental and flooding perspective, that we also understood where do we have residents that have food insecurity, that are on using SNAP benefits, that take public transportation as their primary form of transportation, so that we really understood the full range of risks that would be faced. And then we allowed that to guide our prioritization process.
And so I want to talk about transportation because that is one major focus of this report. You gave a sneak peek to City Council a few months ago where you were showing maps that basically diagram areas that would be inaccessible because of water, flooded streets, and very often not necessarily house flooding, but just even if your neighborhood you can't get in of your neighborhood, you can't get out of your neighborhood, 911 can't get to you, you can't get to the store. So will you talk about that component of this study, how you decided to focus on like the actual street risk?
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it. We didn't want to just think about where is the damage occurring. We wanted to think about the disruption that's occurring. And so even if you live in a home that is at an elevation that was not going to be experiencing flooding during a storm event, if you're required to take a roadway that has a low-lying portion that would be inundated during a storm event, that is going to affect your life. And so if we're trying to make sure the quality of life for our residents is taken care of, we had to look at that. And so we did a road network analysis where we looked at every roadway, city roadway, and actually in state and federal roadways as well. And of course, we have more ability to implement the solutions on our city roads, but we will be working with FDOT and the Federal Transportation Office to share our findings with them as well, so that those can get in their capital planning processes. But we know we need to be looking at our roadways, and one initiative that I'm very excited is coming out of that analysis is I will be working with the city's emergency preparedness division to update our evacuation maps and really overlay where we've seen these roadway vulnerabilities and make sure that none of those are going to be critical evacuation pathways. And if they are, that may cause us to shuffle around the tiering and the prioritization of evacuation zones. So at every hurricane season, it's important to look up your zone beforehand, but especially this next upcoming season, we're hoping to have done that mapping exercise. And so if anything has changed, you'll really want to make sure that you look that up.
That's interesting because you might be now living in a zone 1 or A or whatever it is that's like kind of a first move for evacuation, even though you're inland, even though you're far from the coast or they're possibly even from major water bodies.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say on the transportation front, I mean, that's the capital infrastructure, but one thing you'll find if you look at the document is that we also focused a lot on active and safe bike and pedestrian transportation. And I've often gotten questions, about, well, this isn't flooding. Why is biking involved in a resilient strategy? But we are often one of the top cities for bike and pedestrian fatalities in the country. And if you're thinking about how are you protecting your city, how are you being resilient, that absolutely has to be part of the planning process. So we have a lot of actions that are talking about how can we innovate our roadway designs to promote safer biking and walkability. How are we making it easier for people who live in this city who don't own a vehicle to get around, have access to jobs, and then also thinking about the recreation benefits that come from having improved bike and pedestrian infrastructure.
And so talking about that, is there any element of this plan that looks at the city, the county itself trying to reduce its what's contributing to climate change in terms of our carbon footprint or our greenhouse gas emissions?
The majority of the strategy is really focused on, what are going to be the impacts that we are receiving. But we do have an action in the document on developing a climate action plan. And that's one of the scopes of work that we have a fellow working on over the next year. And that climate action plan will take a deep look at what are our contributions, do a greenhouse gas inventory, see where we might be able to improve the energy efficiency of city buildings, our waste management, all to reduce our contributions to greenhouse gases. And by doing this climate action plan through an EPA grant, we're actually going to be able to qualify for additional federal funding for implementation. So we're really excited about that scope of work and to be stepping more proactively into the sustainability space.
We're joined now by WJCT News Editorial Director Jessica Palombo.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jessica. So, Jessica, there's a panel discussion planned on this resilience report. Tell us what's on deck.
Indeed, yes. So Anne is one of our panelists for this discussion that's happening next week, Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. here at WJCT Public Media Studios. And this is hosted by ADAPT. And for those of you who don't know about ADAPT, we started ADAPT a couple of years back as a way to bring issues about climate change to the local people in a way that is local, that's understandable. We thought of it as, that problem of if you show a picture of a polar bear clinging onto a piece of ice, that's both really far away and both really overwhelming, and people kind of tune that out. But if we talk about ways that our local community is responding to the challenges of climate change, the ways we're adapting to this challenge and rising to it in different ways, this is a way to engage people and get people to think about it and see what they can do and how to get involved. So it's an engagement piece. There are stories. It's all there at jaxtoday.org. Click on Adapt and go to the On Jax Today. Under that menu, you'll find all of the stories. Also, we include events like this next week, which is a panel discussion about the report that you've been talking about. And we'll have Anne, we will have Mayor Donna Deegan there to answer questions about her vision for what to do next with this information. We also will include Logan Cross with the Sierra Club, who is a voice frequently pushing and asking the city to do more and challenging a little bit. And also Emily Pierce, she's a regulatory and land use attorney with Rogers Towers. She will be representing the view of the development community.
It's interesting. We were talking about the role of the development community, and I would guess that's going to be a robust discussion. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. And also, in addition to sharing the stage with Emily next week, I'm excited she'll be a member of our committee helping to update the city's land development regulations. So I think it's important that we really engage the people who understand development the best, and that is developers. And so not to say that there won't be contentious moments over the next year as we really try to put pen to paper and figure out, what is the best way to modify our regulatory process. But I think this event is going to be a really great kickoff to the implementation phase of this strategy. Really, in many ways, getting the document produced is just the starting point. And so I think it'll be a great opportunity for folks to continue asking questions. As you said at the beginning, and this is a 294-page document. So, we've had a chance to talk about it this morning, but there's obviously so many more details that we can dig into on Wednesday.
Tell us a little bit about how people can participate in this, Jessica.
Yes, so we're really encouraged. We've had a lot of people sign up. People are fired up over this topic, but there is still room. So go to wjct.org/events, and it is one of the events there. The event is called A Resilient Jacksonville, I believe. Yes, and we sign up. It's free to register. You can come here, sit in person for the panel discussion from 6 to 7. If you can't come in person, that's okay. We'll have a virtual option as well. So that will be streamed live on the Jax Today Facebook page. And we're looking forward to a great night.
Terrific. It sounds awesome. And I just want to ask you, you talked about a couple fellows that you have now, I guess, working for you. But one of the recommendations of this report is, can I please get some staff so I'm not doing this all by myself? What's the prospect for you getting some actual people, paid working for you in the resilience office?
It's still a little bit in flux, but I'm optimistic. There were, 3 positions approved through the council budget process. I don't have salaries behind it yet, so that is a bit of a sticking point, but it's one of those things that, I think we'll be able to work out. Certainly when you look through the document, there's so many scopes of work. It cannot possibly be on one person. But even as I staff up my team, really a lot of where this work is going to come down to is really in the departments. We aren't trying to create new work streams for resilience. We are looking at how can the resilience team, myself and the fellows I've brought in, and also hopefully some of those staff that we're able to find a way to hire, how can we be facilitating the findings of this and infusing that into department processes? Public Works is always going to be the one building projects.
You're going to have to take over Public Works, right?
Exactly. I'm never going to do that. That's it. I'm not an engineer. You don't want me designing projects, but we do need to take a look at our design standards and how do those need to be updated with better science and data. Similarly, on the permitting side of things, if I have to physically stamp every permit, that the process would grind to a halt. What we need is processes that facilitate smarter decisions being made. And so that's what these regulatory updates, I think, will be able to help us facilitate. So, it's going to be a full city effort, every department at the table, every team really working, but certainly there will also be a need to grow my team as we move forward.
Yeah, I would think so. It does seem like not quite a one-person job to plan resilience for the entire city of Jacksonville. I mean, not to be too on the nose.
Yeah, and I think most other cities, when you look at the size of their resilience office, it's usually a small but mighty team of about 12 to 24 people.
Well, it's been great talking to you. Anne Coglianese, Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Jacksonville, Jessica Palombo from Jacksonville Today, and the new editorial director here at WJCT News. Thanks so much for talking to us about resilience, both of you. And thanks for giving us a heads up on the ADAPT panel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.